who's on the front of this coin? It's James Buchanan. So on this coin, there is a heads and a tails. You don't have a coin if you don't have both sides. Well, when we're looking at this economy stuff, and not just economy, but control, you have the two sides. One is domination, control, abusive power over people and things, abusive power. The other side is greed, the accumulation of wealth. These are the two sides of the coin that I think always go together and are very much at the heart of what happens. So anyway, it was an accident that things got as good as they did. Government doesn't just graciously give people their rights. Men, women have had to use blood, sweat, and tears to accumulate rights. Women had to fight for their rights to vote and to be equal to men, and the struggle goes on. And African Americans had to fight the civil rights, and for many it cost their lives. Blood, sweat, and tears. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people are in that struggle now. Blood, sweat, and tears. And on we can go with so many movements for justice. It doesn't get handed to us graciously by any government. So, way, way back, the wealthy paid 90% of what they got in taxes that belonged to the common good for building the roads and freeways and infrastructure. Then in time it got to be 75% of what they got went in taxes for the common good. Now it's about 35%. And the onslaught goes on and on. I used to remember hearing about the common good. We don't hear about that anymore. So there's an author, Jeff Madrick, who just came out with a book called The Age of Greed. He says by the mid-70s, you had this accumulation unchecked by the government, that greed was let free. The addiction, see, we're talking about addictions that people have. There's never enough. And it started to go run amok in the 70s, he points out. Well, we have to go deeper than that with a social analysis to understand what's happening. Milton Friedman was, professor at the Chicago School of Economics. And in the 60s, he was pushing this version of unfettered, unlimited, laissez-faire capitalism. And in that, he wrote the rule book on this kind of a hypermobile global economy, and it really is about greed. He became a guru in the 70s. People started listening to him. Wow, ooh, ah. Here are some things that are the sole function of the government, the state, as he saw things. Protect our freedom here and abroad, and protecting freedom abroad means we dominate other peoples. The right to make a lot of money off of war and expanding our power throughout the world. And safety here, meaning you have to stifle dissent. If people can't feed their kids and they rise up, you must stifle dissent. So that's the role of the state. And preserve law and order in that sense of law and order. Enforce privatization. There's the idea, why should the government be taking care of paying good salaries and benefits? And why should we be putting out money to protect the environment when there's money to be made? The government shouldn't be doing all that. It should be privatized so that people can make money off of everything. And that's what has been emerging. The government shouldn't run anything that can be privatized for profit. One of these things is deregulation, naming government shouldn't be putting holds on industry or the accumulation of wealth. People in power who have power should be able to make as much money as they want. Government should not interfere at all. That's deregulation. Reduce the social safety net. Costs a lot of money, to take care of those who are handicapped or the poor. Takes a lot of money. Why should that money go into that? There's money to be made. This is behind this laissez-faire, hands-off form of capitalism that has emerged since the 70s in particular. And of course, major tax breaks for the wealthy. The constant cut of taxes to the wealthy. Why? Because greed knows no limit. It's the monopoly game worldwide. So anyway, so Naomi Klein has called this shock doctrine, because these policies, which people in general say no, people don't voluntarily give up their rights and give up a decent way of life. They don't willingly hand that over to the wealthy. So Milton Friedman said you have to have a shock take place. You have to have crisis, catastrophe, so people are in shock, and then you run through your legislatures all these bills that you possibly can, get them in immediately. In other words, you act fast while people are in shock. That's the shock doctrine that has been underway, and this is what's going on. Now, Milton Friedman had his first chance to practice this in Chile in the 1970s under Pinochet, the brutal dictator, with tens of thousands of people being killed who dared to organize or complain against the government. And so the Chicago boys down there, meaning they followed this Milton Friedman school of economics, the Chicago School of Economics. That was the first place. Then Argentina also in the 70s, the same kind of policy. Then in Poland, Solidarity, their awesome nonviolent movement to actually the crumble of communism, but they didn't know economics, the new leaders of Poland, and they got suckered into this kind of shock policy, this Milton Friedman garbage, and it was disastrous. Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom began to try to practice it in a democracy, and she started to cut away at labor unions, destroy the power of unions, trying to use this kind of doctrine. Ronald Reagan in the 80s, remember the 1980s air traffic controllers? He just demolished that resistance of the air traffic controllers, and from there on, whittle away at unions, labor unions, that had blood, sweat, and tears to get what we had by the late 60s, just cutting away, whittling away at it, and that's what's been going on. In China in '89, starting there, the same thing. The communist leaders went to a whole new kind of sprawling export zone, and you ended up with your billionaires arising rapidly. Russia in '93, under Boris Yeltsin, the same thing. Suddenly you had billionaires in Russia and increased poverty because these policies were being introduced. It is absolutely devastating around the world. Back here in 2003, the U.S. government handed out 3,500 contracts to companies to perform security functions. We evolved homeland security, and people are making billions off of all of this sophisticated technology. They know when you sneeze, because we have all this technology of keeping track of people, creating a big brother kind of a society where we are watched constantly, and the power grows over us, over the people. So anyway, all kinds of contracts with this homeland security industry that has sprung up, over a $200 billion industry. So then we had 9/11. Remember shock and awe? Where did that name come from? As we began the war against Saddam Hussein in 2003, shock and awe. It's this kind of policy. It's an economic policy, and the war strategy is to foster that some people get very wealthy. Tenet under the Bush regime. Anyway, on and on. It goes through the 80s and into the 90s and into the current decade. War is extremely profitable. We got 4 wars going on right now. Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Libya. Gee, what a coincidence. All Muslim nations. And demonizing people of all kinds, GLBT people and those illegal aliens coming across our southern borders. Demonize them. They're evil, you know, and GLBT people, as I say, and now Muslims. We create enemies. The government has us be afraid, in shock, so that we, meaning the average American people, have been going along with this onslaught here, and it's all interconnected globally. Then another aspect of it, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, A-L-E-C, American Legislative Exchange Council. So back in the 70s, this was emerging with this laissez-faire capitalism stuff. It was formed, it's become, in its own words, the nation's largest nonpartisan individual public-private membership association of state legislators. State legislators in the 50 states. Few have ever heard of this whole thing. It's the ultimate kind of thing. On the surface, it seems to be a nice, harmless association of thousands of state legislators in America. But you have behind it the wealth of the very wealthy who use these think tanks, conservative think tanks, to draw up legislation that fosters the takeover of America by the very wealthy. And they form legislation for state legislators and for governors of the states. And Rick Snyder, did he create up what he's doing? No, he got the paid. He got the script. He's just doing what other legislators are doing because the very wealthy have crafted legislation for governors and state legislators. They've been doing this since the 1970s. Every area and aspect of our life where there's a buck to be made and power to be had. This is insidious and unbelievably evil. So this infrastructure and network of legislators through the think tanks, the very wealthy. We got, Charles and David Koch, as was mentioned earlier. David Koch founded an organization called Citizens for a Sound Economy. It split off, become Freedom Works. They're an arm of the Tea Party. The Tea Party people aren't all these brilliant souls. They get the script. And they're told what's important and what's evil. David Koch has been instrumental in another new group, Americans for Prosperity. Many have heard of that. David Koch, with his wealth, is very key in arming the Tea Party with the onslaught, the craziness that they're doing. It's not just that they're crazy. They have a script handed to them. So this is what's going on. See, we got to know what's really happening, and we need to help teach each other and learn from one another. Well, anyway, I can go on and on with so many of this. The Bush tax cuts, again, what's the script? People are rewarded if they push through these policies that favor the very few wealthy. Legislators are given the PACs, it's an undermining of democracy.